going to be starting on supply and demand, which is probably something that you've heard of before. Either maybe you took like a high school economics course or something like that, you learned about it, or you just heard the phrase used in connection to economics or not in connection to economics, and it's just something that maybe you've heard of before. So what we're going to be doing in this class is we're going to be showing how you can get to a model. First of all, what supply and demand actually is, right? Not just the phrase and these are English words that we sort of know what they mean, but what do they mean specifically in this class? How can we get a more defined idea of what it is? And then also, over the next few weeks, we're going to show how you can go from that basic idea that we had last time of just, we're interested in how people make decisions, right? We want to know what their incentives are and what choices they're going to make. And I told you that, hey, you can take all these individual decisions that everybody's making, and you could just sort of glom them all together until you get to a market. Well, that's what this is, right? So we're going to go all the way from the individual person who's making a decision all the way up to a market level. And that's going to help us figure out what's going to happen in those markets. We're going to be able to make some predictions and we're going to be able to, say things like, hey, if this is what happens in the market, we expect that this other thing is going to change as a result. Right? You get a sort of sense of how markets work, how you can see where they're going. So what we want to do, we want to explain a couple things. That's what we're doing. We're explaining stuff. First, we want to know, why are prices what they are? Right? When you go into a store or you go to order something, you see that the price is listed there. Where did that come from? I mean, at one level, somebody decided to set that price. Whoever's working at the company selling something to you made a decision. But where did that decision come from? How much control do they actually have over the decision? They have some control. They don't have full control, right? If you went to the store to get a coffee and it was $20, yeah, they can choose to sell you a coffee for $20, but you don't have to buy it. So they're not going to sell it for $20. Like, that's just not how it's going to happen, right? So where's that restriction coming from? Why don't they set it at $20? They'd much rather get $20 from you than $3, but they don't. So why are prices what they are? How do prices change over time and why? If you see somebody, an economist saying, hey, we expect that the price of gas is going to go up in the next couple of months. Well, why do they think that? What are the things that are going into their head when they're making a thought and when they're coming to that prediction? Hey, I think that the prices are going to go up. They must have some idea about how prices work to be able to make that sort of prediction. This sort of model, supply and demand model, is where that thinking about prices is coming from. Second question we want to think about is how much stuff there is. How do people decide how much stuff there's going to be and of what kind of stuff, right? We have stuff available to us to buy in a market situation. But again, why are those the things that are available to sell, right? Why can we buy those things and not other things? Why have people decided to use their productive capacities, their factories, their whatevers, their limited time on this earth to produce one thing and not another, right? If you've ever lived in two different countries, you know that often the items at a grocery store are going to be very different in one country than another. Whoever's producing food in those two different countries has made decisions about what kinds of food they're going to produce and sell you in a market, right? And at one level, that's a decision that they made. Somebody decided that, yeah, we're going to sell gochujang in this supermarket in this country. We're not going to sell gochujang in this supermarket in this other country, right? We're not going to do it. But why? They don't have full control. Again, they have some agency there, but they don't have the complete ability. Part of it depends on what people want to buy in the place where they are. So how do they come to that decision? What's going on there? So then finally, we've figured out what prices are, where they come from, what changes them. We've figured out how do producers decide how much of something to make and what to make. Then finally, we can think about how our goods going to be allocated among people, right? If you have a bunch of stuff, there needs to be some way of figuring out, well, who gets the stuff, right? That is a decision that has to be made in any economy, no matter how it is run, no matter what the political system, no matter what the whatever, right? There has to be some way of figuring out who gets the stuff. That is a decision that gets made at some point. So if we're working in a market economy where a lot of this decision is determined by the market, how does that work out? What happens with that, right? Who gets the stuff? So these are the three things that we want to explain. These are our goals here. And so that's what we're going to be doing when we start talking about supply and demand. We're going to build up from this idea of individual decision-making. We're going to get to a market that we sort of have an idea of how that market's working. And then we're going to use that idea about how markets work to answer these three questions. So we're going to do this with supply and demand, right? And this is what's called a workhorse model. Now, what is a workhorse model? The workhorse model is a basic model that is very easy to interact with, right? And so it leaves out a lot of complexity, but it's flexible, which means, which is why I'm going to start with it, right? As I start telling you about how supply and demand works, immediately in your head, you're going to start thinking, wait a minute, what about this little thing? What about this other thing? I live in the real world. I know some things about how the real world works. You're leaving some stuff out of your model. And I'm going to say, yes, I am going to leave some stuff out of this model. But the reason why we're doing this model anyway, even though it leaves a lot of stuff out, is because it's super flexible. So once we figure out this model, we can come back later, use the exact same stuff that we already know, and just add in the bits that we know are wrong, right? So that's why we're going to do it, because it's very flexible. It's going to be able to be extended later to incorporate all the little real world details that we think are important. Additionally, it's just a really good model, right? Like I said last time, we're not going to get things perfectly. This is social science. Things don't always work the same way all the time, but it works pretty good, right? For a model like this, especially one that's so simple, it does a pretty decent job a lot of the time in explaining how prices go up and down, how much stuff gets produced and what stuff, and how it gets allocated. It just does a good job explaining that stuff in a market economy. So it's a really good way of thinking about prices and how those prices change. And even when it's a little bit too simple for the real world, it still tends to work okay, which is sort of what you want. All right, so let's get into it. So supply and demand is designed to describe how goods are bought and sold in markets. What is a good? A good is anything that you can buy and sell, basically. Anything tangible, like an object that you might buy in a store, or it could also be service. If you get a pedicure, that is a good that you are buying. Somebody waiting tables at a restaurant, that's a good. Really, anything that you can buy and sell is a good. So we're going to examine the market for goods. Right? We want to know how people buy and sell goods. And we're going to do this by looking at two different sides of the market, which you can probably guess what they're going to be. We have the buyers on the demand side of the market. These are the people who purchase the good. And then we have the sellers on the producer side of the market, or the supply side of the market, who produce and or sell the good. So now we got two different kinds of people. They're doing two different kinds of things. They're making two different kinds of decisions. These people are deciding whether or not to buy something, and how they're going to respond to the price for that thing. These people are deciding whether or not to sell something, and how they make those decisions. So if we can figure out how these people make this decision and how these people make their decision, we're going to have a pretty good idea of what's going on in the whole market.